Around 20 years ago, a game changed the medium forever by the name of Silent Hill 2. Here's a video about why. As video games entered the 3D era, they went from predominantly Japanese to a global phenomenon. One consequence was a shift towards American settings. In 1996, Capcom had rebooted a Japanese horror movie adaptation, formerly known as Sweet Home, as a so-called survival horror title set in a small American town. They called it in Japan Biohazard and in the Western markets Resident Evil. The game was a crossover hit and invented a new genre. More examples were forthcoming. The original setting for Square's landmark Final Fantasy VII was actually in New York, while Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid in 1998 was deeply immersed in American culture, as well as politics and geography, showcasing as it did the frozen tundra of Alaska's Aleutian Island archipelago. The technology behind MGS1 would go on to spawn 1999's Silent Hill, with its additional use of real-time 3D, dynamic weather, and a visual style of immersive grit. However, Silent Hill also used pre-rendered cinematics, less like MGS and more like the glossy, beautiful games identified with Konami's rivals, like Square and Capcom. Another major influence on the game was David Lynch's surreal horror soap, Twin Peaks, not to mention the music of American noise rock group Sonic Youth. Silent Hill dealt in imagery derived from American Puritanism. However, the game's awkward character proportions and 2D-esque tank controls made Silent Hill, released as it was at the tail end of the PS1's life cycle, rapidly obsolete. The dev studio within Konami, Team Silent, got to work on the follow-up for the yet-to-debut Sony PlayStation 2. Silent Hill 2 would be something of a sister game to Hideo Kojima's MGS2, Sons of Liberty. They were developed roughly at the same time and would premiere within weeks of each other in the fall of 2001. All original, however, was the game's revolutionary use of what in film is known as psychological expressionism. Popularized prior to World War II by German directors like Fritz Lang, expressionism used the medium of motion pictures to depict events subjectively, bringing the viewer into their characters' inner worlds directly. Soon, Silent Hill would be known for this same sleight of hand. For Silent Hill 2, Team Silent would take a lot of inspiration from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. The novel's descent into the guilt and paranoid hysteria that followed committing a terrible crime would find expression in Silent Hill 2 in the form of protagonist James Sunderland. Narcissism, repression, and the perversion of lust into violence would also all play pivotal roles in Sunderland's own descent into and eventually out of madness. Silent Hill 2 would find for itself a perverse meeting point between the sexualized teen pop idol Christina Aguilera and the infamous serial killer Jack the Ripper. Using the game's format to comment on and critique English-speaking post-Victorian era ideas about men, women, sex, sickness, and morality, unlike any game before. But equally as groundbreaking would be Silent Hill 2's handcrafted facial animations and innovative use of music and sound. Audio director Akira Yamaoka reportedly recorded over 100 different kinds of footstep sounds for the game, while designing some aspects of its ambient compositions to occur randomly. Where some players would hear whispers or crying, others would hear shattering glass, screams, or even a squealing pig. The likeness not only of Christina Aguilera but also Sandra Bullock would appear in-game, while Team Silent would also use the newfound graphical fidelity offered by the PS2 to create unsettling doppelgangers in the form of two characters, Mary, James' dearly departed wife, or the Virgin Mother figure, and his imaginary whore figure, Maria. Silent Hill 2, in some ways like Metal Gear Solid 1, would defy the standard by using its visuals to express ugliness and obscured, often muddy or exceptionally dark environments. A huge number of different musical motifs and themes ensured that no two areas had the exact same sound, while a musique concrete and industrial drone sensibility brought new musical styles with Silent Hill 2 into a major release for the first time. But what all this was in service of was Silent Hill 2's commitment to expressionism. Building off the dual realities conceit from the first game, nearly every location in Silent Hill 2 features two versions, one dreamlike, the other its nightmarish reality. The buildup of pain, guilt, and fear suffered by the game's narcissistic protagonist finds expression directly through interactivity, as the player must navigate Sunderland's hellish, psychosexual underland to function as a facsimile for James's conscious mind. The game itself, meanwhile, adopts the role of his unconscious, lashing out at us and transforming at the drop of a hat. The further you delve into the darkness of Silent Hill 2, the more visibly it seems to become unhinged from reality. The game would get great mileage not only from the oppressiveness and claustrophobia of silence and cramped environments, but also of the unseeable. Several iconic sequences require the player to charge into some great and terrifying unknown, from the darkened, dirtied corridors of woodside apartments to the vertical and horizontal mazes underground the Silent Hill Historical Society, to the immense void surrounding you as Sunderland crosses the Toluca Lake. Meanwhile, in a huge development from the original game's radio mechanic, often you only know the position of an enemy relative to the sound of blaring static that comes from your radio. As James, you usually have to decide between the visibility of an enemy to you and your own to them, as James's flashlight and radio both illuminate monsters but also attract them to him. The weaponry that Sunderland has to choose from is itself part of this trade-off between fighting monsters and resembling one, as saving precious bullets takes brutally bludgeoning your tormentors to death. That several enemies resemble distorted sexual fantasies and fetishes, from S&M to nurse play, gives Silent Hill 2 that psychosexual dimension whose contours won't become fully clear until the end. One of the primary ways Silent Hill 2 borrowed from expressionism is with its camera angles. Though the player had somewhat more control, generally speaking much like Silent Hill 1, many of the angles seen in the game are set in advance. Whether a given area features, say, overhead view, a straight-on shot, or sideways angles, plays a pivotal role in its tone and overall emotional resonance. This subtle question of what in cinema we call the mise-en-scène is very crucial to explaining Silent Hill 2's brilliance. How a scene, or in gaming terminology, a scenario, plays out visually on screen can make a huge difference, perhaps nowhere more than in horror games. Something of a lost art today in the era of standardization. In Silent Hill 2's era, more experimental era, the camera and how the devs positioned it in a given moment was crucial. Take, for example, the first encounter with Pyramid Head. The camera during the cutscene first confronts you with his psychosexual violence, then presses in on Sunderland, oppressing as well as obscuring our view. Then, abruptly, the first fight begins, with James already backed into a corner, and the camera, paired with the room dimensions, make it difficult to even see Pyramid Head unless he's nearly already right on top of you. The use of both environmental and camera-imposed claustrophobia is crucial to Silent Hill 2's atmosphere of horror, as this sequence makes clear. Another good example is when you arrive at Rosewater Park, or for that matter, the forest at the very start. By positioning the camera in front of you instead of behind, simply playing Silent Hill 2 requires, through interaction, literally barreling down towards the unknown, but more specifically, not only the unknown, but the repressed, what Sunderland refuses, literally, to see. In a famous moment, Silent Hill 2, maybe as an homage to the genre film noir, has prison bars which seem to press in on James as much as the actual prisoner, Maria. This of course begs the question in this scene, which of the two is the real prisoner? When you enter the club Heaven's Night, meanwhile, you're forced to drape Maria in light, throwing a shadow of your dead wife on the wall. Little details and expressionistic flourishes like these are everywhere in Silent Hill 2, and they're all important to why the game is still such an icon. Silent Hill 2 shared much in common with its predecessor, from mechanics to even similar scenarios, enemies, and tone. But unlike Silent Hill 1, which was more of an occult, gothic, almost Lovecraftian horror game, Silent Hill 2 was more psychological, and, as I've said, expressionistic. But this went further than camera angles and intense soundscapes. Silent Hill 2 used the medium itself to change dynamically over time in tandem with Sunderland's psychological journey. The text of the letter that James receives to kickstart the game, for example, gradually disappears over time. There's a poster of none other than Maria in the bathroom at the start of the game, and the room's color palette matches that of Pyramid Head. As you near Silent Hill proper, a second set of footsteps dogs your trail, pursuing you like James's guilt. Along the way, you stumble onto a few corpses in the game. They're dressed in your clothes, just like the open grave you have to jump down into bears on its tombstone the name James Sunderland. Imagery of corporal punishment and suicide seem to follow you around, and the furthest, deepest levels of Sunderland's nightmare are down under the Silent Hill Historical Society, where the walls and waterlogged floors give the impression you're inside some giant living body. A similar effect can be observed in the Woodside Apartments. Where you can hear breathing in a certain spot. This happens yet again numerous times throughout the game, including in Brookhaven Hospital. Maria is repeatedly killed right in front of you, only to reappear unharmed later down the way. Eddie, the fat slob murderer, resembles a twisted version of James, just as the mannequin you get the flashlight from early in the game wears, unmistakably, the same clothes as Mary. Speaking of mannequins, a type of enemy in the game is called a mannequin, and at E3 2001, the game's booth featured mannequins of both James and Laura. In the Blue Creek Apartments, there's a random chance that you might hear the following whispered phrase. See my dead wife come home to do some laundry. There's a reason that there are posters of the famous scene of Jack Nicholson busting through the door from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining at the start of this game. Silent Hill 2 would derive a ton of influence from the film, especially by way of the eerie significance, like room 237 in the movie, of rooms with the number 208. In the Lakeview Hotel, room 208 is where a man can be heard crying. In the Woodside Apartments, meanwhile, room 208 is where you find a James body double who blew his brains out. And room 208 is also on the door where you find Maria's dead body underground. There's even a second distinct nod to The Shining's plot from the original novel by Stephen King, when you can discover the cause of the hotel fire was a caretaker named Johnny who didn't watch the boiler closely enough, which is exactly what causes the Overlook Hotel in the book to burn down. It would be little touches like this that would truly make Silent Hill 2 a masterpiece of psychological horror and expressionism. All in all, Silent Hill 2 was not only one of the best survival horror games, but one of the best games, period, ever made. Its darkly haunting and hypnotically surreal story is enough even now, 2 decades on, to keep you up all night, while its themes have an intimacy and a twisted logic to them that few of its rivals can compare to. Sadly, like MGS, the Silent Hill series was effectively euthanized by a supposedly greedy and short-sighted Konami. But the original trilogy live on as some of the best games ever, and at the height of their achievements sits Silent Hill 2. Until next time, boss.